I'm Ryan Nolet. Um, I work at Carbon Black. If you guys have heard of that company, we have a couple of cool tools. To give you an idea, what we're going to be talking about today is kind of an extension of two of the other talks. The last one with malware pipelining and the one before that that dealt with ransomware. The difference between the talks is I'm going to show you both an attack and a defense that you can repeat. That I'm not going to be, responsible for what you do with it, but you're going to have some ways to play, as well as I'm going to be able to skip over a bunch of the beginning stuff of what is ransomware and whatnot, because we've already talked about it a bit. And now my slides are actually going to work. Awesome. So, welcome to the presentation. I currently run security operations for Carbon Black. As a disclaimer, some of the screenshots in here do have the company's products on it, but that's mostly because I don't have to pay to use them, and they work pretty good. But I promise you no one in marketing has seen this, or HR, as you'll find out. So you don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. I'm going to give you guys an overview really quickly, what I do, some of the uses, why I can talk about some of this stuff, as well as show you the entire attack chain from once you get onto the system. I left out the actual exploitation portion of the attack because then I'm really going to be responsible for doing terrible things. So I only want to show you the parts that you'll have to work on to reproduce. The specific variant that I'm going to be talking about is CryptoLocker version 1, and that's particularly because I only have time to go for one variant, time box wise. So first of all, as I said, I run security operations. I've been doing threat research, forensics on Linux, Mac, Windows for probably about 10 plus years now. Slide that over. And some of my daily responsibilities now are as the main security engineer for the company. I do a lot of the architecting of the solutions, but I also like to go to the dark places on the internet and poke it with a stick. And I've been able to actually implement a bunch of that into the products. Speaking of the ransomwares, I actually invented a way to block the infection of CryptoLocker version 1, 2, and 3 from actually happening on the system. And I can talk a bit more about that later because it's not particularly related to this, but I'm sure we can find a beer somewhere and talk about it. This is what I describe my job as. Not only do we eat our own dog food, but we also clean up after it. I highly suggest you do the same with any technologies that you guys do. But first and foremost, I'll jump through this real quick, the what's ransomware. Really good before, the basic definition. It basically, ransomware blocks you from being able to utilize your system from one fashion or another. It encrypts files, it will block processes from running, it has a whole bunch of things that it can do. It mostly made the news because of the encryption aspect of the ransomware. Previous versions were really more of crapware. It was a joke, right? You had a nice pop-up on your screen. It told you that you've looked at something terrible and you need to pay the money or they're going to tell everyone. You could go kill the processee in Task Manager, reboot your system, clean the files, and like nothing ever happened. That's no longer the case. The options that the ransomware can do to your system are pretty numerous. They demand money, all kinds of other good things, but by far and away, the most evil thing I've seen ransomware do is make you complete surveys in order to get your stuff unlocked. That is one devious, maniacal D-bag for sure. As we're talking about the malware pipeline, I have one that I built, and I was trying to figure out why the execution wouldn't finish for about 10,000 runs of a file, and it kept stopping every couple of runs, and I finally viewed it live, and it was because I was trying to get my automated system to complete a survey. So always good stuff. So skipping through that, I'm going to skip into what vShadow is. This also got brought up during the ransomware topic because one of the things that ransomware does is it goes in and removes vShadow, your actual shadow copies on the system by using vShadow or VSSAdmin or one of the other tools that ends up actually interacting and managing your shadow copies on your system. For those of you that don't know what shadow copies are, those are backups of your files. Probably everyone has seen this host property screen before, and sometimes when your Office application crashes, you'll have those backup recoverable files, and then if you click on that document that crashed, sometimes it'll have previous versions saved, and you can restore from those previous versions. That's the most common use. The vShadow is the command line tool that you use to interface with these shadows, and it's a tool made by Microsoft that is available after Windows XP, kind of pretty much available for all the systems. You can get a bunch of different emulators. They have the 32-bit and the 64-bit in order to go with the in order to work on the different systems. But prior to that, this wasn't available for an attack vector because it wasn't actually built into XP, and think until after Service Pack 3. Like Vista was already out, and then they backported a lot of it. The reason why we bring up why this is so interesting is because VSSAdmin is a Microsoft signed binary. So the attackers are leveraging legitimately signed binaries into their attack, which makes them look even more like legitimate behavior on your system. Much harder to detect, much harder to defend against, and because you're using a legitimate workflow to go through the attack, you can take different vectors to get to the same legitimate execution, and it gives the attackers a lot more flexibility in what they're going to do. So I'm going to show you guys how to use Microsoft against itself. We're going to break some stuff. As the disclaimer said, please use your best judgment. But let's break something. All right. The variant of CryptoLocker that I'm going to talk about is specifically known for deleting the volume shadow copies. And this basically stops you from restoring from backup locally on the system. This is all going to be aimed towards if you had a ransomware infection on Grandma Joe's system. I like that name. I'm going to keep using that one. Not in your enterprise for this first portion. So I'm only going to be looking at tools that are available to you on Grandma Joe's system. All right. I've observed a lot of various techniques utilizing volume shadows. Lately, it's been for avoiding detection and what's called anti-analysis or anti-forensics. As spoke out in the malware pipeline talk, attackers are putting different code into their malware in order to avoid being analyzed or to be found. The difference between something like this for an anti-forensics angle versus using the red pill type code snippet is this isn't trying to hide from virtualization. This is trying to hide from incident responders, your CERT team, the person who's going to go onto a system that you already know is compromised because you've been alerted somehow, some way, and they are trying to hide the file system artifacts as well as the trail to where the infection actually lives. The technique that I'm going to show you is a 4-part technique. I'm skipping over the exploitation stage, and I'm going right into the attackers drop the malware on the file system via whatever infection mechanism they want. They create a volume shadow. They then mount the shadow and execute the malware, and then they unmount and delete the shadow. What this does is after unmounting and deleting of the shadow, the executed malware is still running. So I'll show you how that kind of attack works. And basically what we're doing is removing file system artifacts. So if you drop this into a copy of Ncase or something like that, you're not going to have file system artifacts to work with to do that audit trail or the forensic analysis. First and foremost, we've got to create a shadow. So what we do here is we end up running the vShadow executable with the -p option. What this is doing is this is P kind of pointing at the source that you're going to end up copying and creating the shadow of. In this case, we're saying the root C directory. you can make this whatever file path you want. I'm doing it to make it simple and short. And what we're doing there is we're mounting this, and now we have basically created a persistent shadow of the full C drive. There's a bunch of links in it now, so what is C/malware/badguy.exe is now mountable in different places in the file structure, in your entire directory tree, pretty much. You can choose wherever you want to go. One of the things to pay attention to here is where it says shadow name. I realize pointing at the screen you can't see what I point at. The shadow name I named volume shadow copy 3. The reason I bring this up is this is basically what the identifier is for the rest of the attack, so you know we're working with the same stuff. So what we do next is we mount the shadow with the make link command. Once again, this is creating those links, the pointers between what actually exists in the file system and what exists inside the shadow. The next thing that we're doing is we are now taking that shadow and we're creating a new directory in the System32 directory called MSDC. If you guys were doing an analysis on a system and you saw something running out of System32/MSDC, you probably think it's Microsoft related, right? Normally when you're going through file system, you're looking for low-hanging fruit, what doesn't really look normal. This is going to end up off of your short list for the first run a lot of the time. It looks pretty legitimate. What we're doing here is we're creating a symlink between this new directory that we just created in System32 and that shadow copy of root C directory. The malware, the binary, is now placed in the root of the shadow. So inside the shadow copy C/malware.exe is the actual legitimate path of this. However, because of the links that we created, when you look at it in Task Manager or you're looking at it in the command prompt to look at where stuff is coming from, it now looks like it's running out of System32/MSDC. In this case, I made the binary be called malware.exe. I actually just cloned command.exe and renamed it. It's a binary. We could have made it do whatever we wanted. Once the symlink's created, the contents of the shadow are accessible via normal file system operations. So once again, you can dir the directory. You can interact with it through other scripts, applications. This makes it look like it exists just as if it was actually running on your file system and not inside the shadow. So what we're doing here is I'm going to create and actually execute this malware and make it run. I'm doing all this graphically. This would all be done via a script, but that's not as much fun to see. And also I get to make more arrows, and I really like those. Once the file system setup's in place, the malware started just like any other executable. You can kick that off any way you want through Command Shell, double-clicking it. There's a million ways to execute stuff. When the malware started and is shown in a tool like Process Explorer, or in this case, we're looking at Task Manager, it shows that it's actually running out of System32/MSDC/malware.exe, which, as we know, doesn't really exist because we just created it for the shadow. This does not exist on the file system. There's no file system artifacts for it. It's a link. It does not exist. So the path, as we were saying, it doesn't really look that suspicious at first glance. Pretend it's not called malware.exe, but it looks very legitimate at that time. Once the malware started, the attacker can unmount and delete the shadow, and the malware will continue to run. The attacker wants to remove as much forensic evidence as possible so they will remain persistent and undetected. One of the downsides of this technique is if they decide to reboot the system, the malware goes away, because at this point it's only running in memory because they have now unmounted the shadow and deleted the shadow. The file system artifacts are gone. It is all in memory at this point. The technique's a nice hiding mechanism, throws in a little anti-forensics, will really piss off investigators, and is really commonly seen against server architecture, not specifically Grandma Joe's system, because that's a one-off. It's not really worth using this giant exploit and this really cool way to hide when they can just drop a normal binary on it, because she'll never know what to look for. So in this case, you're looking specifically to put this on systems that are not often rebooted. Financial institutions were talked about a lot today. A lot of their trading platforms, anything that's high frequency trading, mainframes that have the Windows plugin and attachments with it, those are also really popular for these kind of things. So we're going to go over a little bit of the visibility, what happened on the system. For these next couple of steps, I'm going to do a mix of what you see on the actual system versus what I can see in an IR tool that I was using. You can interchange this section with any IR tool that you want to use that has both visibility to the file system as well as the memory. So we're going to answer two questions here. What happened on the host from the host point of view, and what happens on the host when you're actually doing an IR on this system. Keep in mind that the two main things that we're doing here is we're doing visibility and accountability. And the more you increase your visibility, the tighter the loop gets around your actual target, and now you can account for who did what and when, and that's what we're going to try and answer. So you don't have to memorize this slide. There will be a test later, though. But this is just to give you an idea of these are all the different artifacts that we get to look and see and play around with. The reason I bring this up first and foremost is so you have an idea. You don't have to look at the very specifics, but just look at the title lines, right? Multiple files were written, multiple files were read, new processes respond, the registry was touched. It did a ton of crap on that system, pretty much, right? Very, very noisy. But how will we know that if everything ran throughout the shadow? We don't. So let's look at what happens from these different viewpoints. First and foremost, the IR tool, once again, yes, my company that I work for makes this tool. I'm not marketing it. I get it for free, so I get to play with it. Process trees. When you're doing an IR, you're going to want to build this out anyways, manually. I have a nice pretty graphic. It did it for me. Sweet. But you can do this with command line tools as well. There's a bunch of free options you can use. Google for IR tools, free IR tools. There's another one that you can do, process analysis trees or visualizing process analysis. Those are good keywords to search for, some free tools that will actually build something very similar. There's actually a tool by a guy who works for Google that I was on the forensic lunch. If any of you have watched that podcast, we were both on at the same time, and he has a freeware one that's up on GitHub. If you remind me later, I'll find what the link is for you and give you that. So you don't have to pay to play here. In our initial investigation, we can see that the process tree of this file, based on the alert that I would get that led me to this, is that vssadmin.exe execution. And that's the thing that I really care about, because that doesn't happen very often on endpoint systems. Enterprise-grade backup solutions don't use vssadmin, right? They're very particularly usually targeted towards your NAS or your servers, and those will have proprietary products on it for the backing up. What I'm able to do here is I'm able to backtrack from the vssadmin all the way up to the originating file and process that kicked off this entire tree. In this case, you can see that it's a .exe with a really long name because I downloaded it from VirusShare, which was already mentioned. Malware.com is also a cool one. I have a giant list. I know there's some students in here, so ping me up later and I'll give you a list of tools that are all free that you can use to build your own malware lab with. But I'm not responsible for what you do in it. One of the very interesting things that you can see is that icon at the beginning on the left. That's a PDF icon, but it's an executable. So already in the attack for how that got dropped to the system, they tried to obfuscate their origination. They pretended they were a PDF, they were really a binary, and they executed and drove this whole tree forward. One of the other nice things also spoke about was VirusTotal already. They have an API, which is great. There's another GitHub that has VirusTotal Uploader, I think it's called. Somebody already built the API Python script for you, and all you have to do is download that package, drop in your actual API key, and then you can start submitting things and also querying VirusTotal for hashes you find. That is free and is a really cool tool to help you start doing some automation for actually analyzing systems, seeing if anybody found this stuff before, and if so, it'll give you reports back and prints it to a nice CSV. What I have here is the equivalent of that, where I submitted this hash to VirusTotal, and it came back as a score of 43. We should probably look at that, right? That's not really something you want there, ever. That's just a really, really bad idea. And keep in mind, VirusTotal right now only has 56 AVs that it goes through. So 43 out of 56, it's probably bad. I downloaded this from, I said VirusShare, and I downloaded one that I knew had a high VirusTotal hit in order to make the nice, pretty pictures. But you're going to get different scores, and the big thing here is, following your intuition. One of the things with IR is everybody's trying to bucket things and create fundamental processes and structure, and that's great. But it's also similar to forensics, where it's also a bit art mixed in with science. The best way to learn it is to do it over and over and over again until you start seeing the patterns. So this is where one of the things that's a nice cheat sheet, but it doesn't actually give you any extra knowledge and help going forward. So let's look what the binary did. So that actually displays pretty decent. Above we can see, I bucketed what it did to the file system in 3 groups here. Processes that it spawned, so that originating process ended up spawning a child process, and that child process spawned 2 other child processes. So now we have originating process all the way down to the grandchildren processes. This is one of the things that's really hard to automate when you're looking for basically the execution chain or kill chain, however you want to describe it. Kill chain's also interused with the attack chain that happens, so it depends what terminology you're used to. The reason why that really matters is actually this has been a theme so far in the conversations, is behavioral analysis versus looking just at the single infection vector. You want to see what chains off of it, what creates the child processes, what do the child processes touch, because these days the originating process usually isn't the one doing the damage, and that makes it much harder to find with different IR tools and security tools that do a lot of scanning. There's a lot of scan-based stuff, and if you're not watching the entire time, you miss the creation of child processes and being able to actually find root cause for when one of these goes off. Another thing that happens here is registry mods. So as we know, and we spoke about earlier today with the ransomware, is Locky and CryptoLocker and a few other variants, I think CryptoWall was another one, end up writing things to the registry. Usually it has 2 or 3 registry keys. The first registry key is it ends up adding an entry to either the run or run once registry value. Those are run at login on a system, and what that does is it gives you consistent persistence. You can shut down the computer, you can have AV try to delete the original files, but when you reboot, it's going to end up restarting the executable from the registry value, because those get called and get read, and it points to where another copy of the binary is, and it ends up running over and over. So this is a form of persistence. Another thing that we see here is a bunch of new files were created. And speaking of persistence, these are your file system artifacts for persistence. So there's one here in app data. They drop another one in the startup directory. So that directory is where all your files that load when you log into your system will load up for you. Some of you stick your Outlook there. You set it to start whenever you log in. That's where that's kind of stored, that shortcut. Also, this gets dropped into another directory on the C drive, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, the attacker created about 6 different copies of the exact same binary and dropped them in different places in the OS, and then put links in the registry to kick them off. So that is one very effective way, because you're looking for all these binaries. You find one, all right, are you going to keep looking to find more? Are you going to keep looking to find more? I salute his tenacity, but that kind of paranoia is really not healthy, and I'm very impressed that he went to those levels. What we can see here based on all of this is you can either spend a few hours trying to clean this system, or do what most of us would do, nuke it from orbit. Next, we're going to talk about from the host point of view. So once again, I had a nice fancy tool that does all this stuff for me. How are you going to do this without those? How are you going to do this for free? How are you going to do this on Grandma Joe's system that doesn't have access to any of these nice shiny tools? Well, first and foremost, I'm looking for common things. When I spoke about IR and forensics being a bit more art than science, and you got to kind of follow your intuition, you're really banking on your experience. I spent years working at a financial institution where I dealt with banking Trojans. So Zeus, SpyEye, etc. I have massive databases of these things. Black Exploit Toolkit that dropped all this crap, Angular, all those things. I had to create behavioral analysis for it. I had to create databases that could correlate the changes in it to find out where this crap is. So a couple of the places that I look for first and foremost is things like the user app data, particularly roaming. So if we are on Windows 7, Windows 8, I don't remember if Windows 10 has the same structure in app data, but depending on whether or not you have local admin for your user is where this stuff will get dropped. App data for the active user is extremely common for banking Trojans, and it is one of the first places I look for persistence mechanisms because it's that common. It's still common to this day, to the point where I have scripts that will just go out and it will grab a few different directories and just list me the entire directory and the child directories of it, so that way I can just quickly go through and say, this isn't something that I already know. So now we have to start a real investigation, or bam, I found one thing, excellent, pull that thread, follow it through. There's a few other places to check. We spoke about the startup programs directory. That's another popular persistence mechanism directory where they drop the binaries there. A lot of times they'll use something like C/drivers/ whatever the malware is, because if any of you have ever run a Dell, that's where Dell often expands and drops their crap, which depending on who wrote that driver, it could be malware. Extremely common, and this is one of the first places I look. The second thing I do is I start looking for more persistence mechanisms. So once again, this is the start menu, one that we just dropped into. So here, this is actually in the app data directory. So the two that we've done is basically C/user/ what's the username, master /app data /roaming. That's usually where the first persistence mechanism goes. So you have the malicious file up on the internet, gets dropped down to your system, however it's going to be, email, exploit kit, whatever. It gets executed. The first place it normally copies itself off to is that app data directory, and then it deletes the originating file from the directory that it was in. Most users will be, oh, it went away, let me re-download it, etc. Once it gets dropped to this directory, it actually starts expanding out and starting to clone itself all over the place. That nice list of files that we just spoke about, those are all in different persistence directories, and they were all written by this file. Next thing we're going to look at is a couple of other nice things. The malware created its own directory with a bunch of gibberish on the actual root C drive, and inside that drive, lo and behold, there's another copy of the malware. It's just all over the system at this point. You can tell the malware author is very, very afraid of these binaries being found and creates backups of backups of backups of backups. I already used my paranoia joke, so I can't reuse it now, but it's really not healthy. Next up is the registry actions. So one of the things we just spoke about was the run once directory, creating the mechanism for persistence and starting up on reboot and login. This right here, you can see from the values that what it does is it ends up creating a value inside that registry key. What I can infer from this is that it is a persistence mechanism. I'm not guessing at this point. Putting things into this registry value will only have one of two things happen. It'll start in boot or it'll break. Those are your two options when you drop something in there and point it. Very rarely do you see more legitimate applications use this. Usually it's done by system administrators who want things to start on boot. So system administrators that have very complex AD environments will end up putting scripts in their builds and pointing it to the run once, so every time you log in, it'll correctly mount your network drive because AD is so broken in their environment that they can't do it through that mechanism. There's also things like Wi-Fi fixers, all kinds of stuff that would get dropped in there. These are keys for background services, such as the remote registry service, and they're only run once per boot. Next up is what happens. So we have the persistence mechanisms, we have the binaries all over the place, we have the registry values showing that it's going to get run. How do we know what got hit? CryptoLocker 1 was kind of nice. They have, I call this the middle finger directory because it's just showing you how boned you are. This is every file that it has successfully encrypted. And this is the one that makes people cry. Lastly, oh, it didn't actually. All right, I have another picture that I was actually almost already shown. The CryptoLocker lock screen is the last thing the user actually sees because at that point you are owned. And it's the last thing that you see. The CryptoLocker variant, as was already mentioned, drops on the system, runs, scans for network drives, tries to encrypt them first, then encrypt the local drives, because if the user doesn't know what's going on, they're not going to shut off their computer and try to stop it from encrypting things. So how do we detect this attack? There was a lot of information about how different files were created, different things in the file system that were changed, all these variants. So first and foremost, you got to work with what tools you have, right? Here, I have broken out the attack into a few different things. In particular, what I'm looking for is illegitimate use of the Microsoft binary. And this binary that we're talking about is the vShadow binary. There's a 32-bit and a 64-bit version for each OS and minor OS revision. So this is not a complete list. This is just the ones I pulled off MSDN a little while back. So what I can do is either a manual search with these hashes to look for these files actually being on a system, and then mark those systems as a higher criticality because I know that they can get exploited this way. Or I can have a tool or a SIM end up alerting me when one of these binaries are actually executed. That's your choice. Use the tools that you have. Play around with that stuff. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm using the carbon black endpoint respond. Yeah, they changed the names very shortly ago, and I'm still getting used to them. This is the one that shows me what executions happen on the system, registry, processing, etc. So what I can do is I can write a rule that specifically says if the VSS admin is executed, alert me. Well, that's cool, but depending on how it's executed is whether or not it actually gets shown. So we should actually more look at the dependencies of it. What does VSS admin need on that system to run and then end up being used and abused by the attacker? Well, we can look at the DLL that it loads when VSS admin goes. VSS admin can get used in different queries. It can get used in various different uses. but vss.ps.dll is only used when VSS admin is executed. So that's one of the first things I started to look for. Set this alert, see when it executed and how it's executing. Lo and behold, I kicked this off in an environment of about 5,000 endpoints, and I have false positives. There's this file called weirfault.exe, which I can't remember what it does, but it also uses that DLL. So I just made it ignore that pretty much and started to minimize this. The second thing that we know happens is when this happens, you're kicking off basically a script to infect. So what our scripts run as, mostly on Windows systems, they're batch files. And batch files, when they run under command.exe as the process. So it's almost like you're running directly from the command line. It's just running as a script form. So what I do here is I look for the command line execution of the make link command. Who here has actually seen make link happen in a legitimate context? Hand? No? All right, well, you get the point. The last thing that I look for is vshadow.exe at the command line being run with that -p option in order to create the pointer and that symlink. So these are three different queries that you can run in your environment that you can run as batch scripts. You can run it depending on what your security tools on the actual system can see. Here's three different variants. One uses memory, one's particularly looking at a DLL, one's looking at a particular executable, and another one is looking for a particular command line command. Those are four different vectors that you can now look at for this one attack and get, I don't want to say no false positives, but I only ran it in a system of 5,000, so I don't know what your environment's going to look like. Next, we could also look for that volume shadow name. So we know that shadow copies are being made. What we know for sure is there has some default naming schemes. If you don't specify names and you just run the default commands, you're going to end up with something that looks like hard disk volume shadow copy or hard disk volume. If you've ever looked at the command line output from you mounting a drive at boot, if any of you have ever gotten that blue screen of death, you've probably noticed that the actual C drive that you have mounted before it gets mounted and called the C drive is called a hard disk volume, because that's the actual name for the physical asset, and it's the same name used for the virtual asset. So when you're running systems, you shouldn't see this going off, and this is another thing that you can look for. So the last thing, I don't know what time it is. I don't know if I'm going over. 3 o'clock. All right, sweet. I think I only have like 5 more slides. And this is probably the one that you guys actually care about, how to stop the attack. So we went over the basics of ransomware. We went over the basics of vShadow, some of the common places it stands for the attack. But how do we stop it? This is really what I care about mostly at this stage in my career, because I run SecOps, so I'm mostly defense. We get to do offensive things. I get to do threat research. I get to poke at stuff. But what really matters at the end of the day is how am I protecting my enterprise? So first and foremost, a good backup plan. That has to get put out of the way before we get technical stuff. Anything proactive you can do is really going to save your bacon. It reduces your risk surface. It ends up helping you out in the long run. You can create the shadow copies manually. You can restore from them. This is the mechanism I would use. There's professional tools that do it better, but these are available on any Windows system. There's multiple methods. You can look them up online. There's also whitelisting options. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to show you a whitelisting option. Those of you who know, one of the company's products is a whitelisting product. I'm not using that one because that costs money, and the one I'm going to show you is free. So don't tell marketing or sales, because they'll be very pissed at me. So what is whitelisting like for these kind of attacks? I equate it to basically computerized shot blocking, right? You're just going to get slammed. You try to install stuff, you get denied. And the more you watch this, you can see the kid's soul actually get crushed. Short of whitelisting, you can implement a rule based on your use case, unique to your environment variables and your desired outcome, right? The rules I'm going to show you are in a high-level format because even if you aren't using the fancy IR tools, you can apply this logic and use your actual controls in your environment, specifically leveraging things like GPO, witchcraft, and a lot of cursing. These are going to kind of work for you guys. So first and foremost, user training, right? Don't click on the bad links. Here's a bunch of things that we're going to end up using as artifacts to look for and to block. What we spoke about a few minutes ago was the persistence mechanisms, right? So if you remember that nice pretty picture of the kill chain, what we're looking at is originating execution, child processes, file writes, but the originating process doesn't end up doing the damage to the system. It's the child processes. So in order to bring down the malware, we have to stop the child processes. The mechanism that I created for CryptoLocker version 1, 2, and 3 is actually a registry block. I'm going to show you a file system block because this works not just for CryptoLocker, but it also works for different kinds of Trojans. So first and foremost, let's use your security policy. So you create a software restriction policy for a single computer, either using local security policy editor or for your entire domain by using a group policy editor. Here, I have the local policy editor because they wouldn't let me play with the domain one. I don't know why. So first and foremost, you need to create a new policy, right? This is boring. This is stuff that you got to go through in order to do it. Here's a bunch of steps. But what really matters is step number 5. This is where you end up finding all your software restriction policies. These are where they're all written. These are ones that get disseminated out to the different systems. And these are where you're actually going to revise things, tighten it up if you have false positives, create exceptions, etc. What you're really doing here is you're creating a new path rule. And what you're basically doing is this nice short process that will end up allowing you to create this. What we're going to look at is particularly the executable in the app data. This is how I kept Zeus out of a financial institution that I worked for. It was very simple. We wrote this and it stopped for a good year and a half before SpyEye came out with a lot of the code because the code got leaked and now it started to use extra file paths when we had to revise this, but this is very similar. Notice that the security level is disallowed. That means it won't run, just as you expected. It would. It doesn't create flowers or clowns. It doesn't let things run. What really matters here is choosing the file path. This is where you're going to have collateral damage. Things like Spotify, Firefox, Chrome, they all update out of app data, which if any of you write software know it is against best practices to do so, and it's a terrible idea to run things out of app data. It's meant for config files and storage, not binaries. So if you have those applications in your environment, you're going to have collateral damage with this rule. So remember to create some exceptions in there, or sales will be upset, and so will your C staff. Next up is it is now implemented. That was a pretty short process. You just saved your enterprise a ton of money, and I'll take that in checks if you have it, cash, ice cream, whatever form of payment you want. In the words of Doctor Who, it's defended, just like the Earth, but really it comes down to dropping the band hammer on things. In closing, ransomware is annoyingly effective. Recent additions of features such as removing shadow copies make it even more dangerous. Regardless of what security products you use, your best defense is user training and backups. Rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. Anything preventative that you can implement proactively, whether it's automated tools, manual implementation, anything like that will help you protect your company more than any kind of shiny tool with an unlimited marketing budget. And no matter what the sales guy tells you, you get to live in reality. Nothing's a magic bullet, right? So thank you all for your time today. My motto, as you'll see on the blog post that I do, flag it, tag it, and bag it, also known as the double tap, as needed. And questions? Yes, they are. Not immediately after this. I am presenting this at SANS DFIR next month and hopefully at DEF CON and Black Hat this year. And they have a weird rule about releasing the slides. So by the end of June, I'll know whether or not I can give them to you then or at end of August. Either way, I will release them. I just am contractually obligated not to yet. Cool. Yes?
So you mentioned that, especially like enterprise settings, nobody uses VChat, using those types of copies. Is there any reason why you can't just get rid of that process in general?
Just because the enterprise doesn't use it for its legitimate purposes, some applications might use it. It varies upon your environment. So first thing you got to do is visibility accountability argument, right? Increase your visibility. Do you know what applications are running in your environment? For those of you who work in the enterprise, I'd like to see a hand for anyone that can tell me every application running in their environment. Yes, that is the answer. Snarky, I know, but unless you have really good auditing tools or something like an endpoint product that will give you visibility into what's running on each system, you can't know, and therefore you don't know your conflicts until you start implementing things. So trial runs, small groups, etc. That's the only way you can get up to the point of blocking something that is kind of built into the OS. Anybody else? Cool. Well, thanks, guys.